Hey everybody, Jake here, and today I just want to talk a little bit about nibs. This is not going to be a primer on nib sizes, standard gauge nibs that you should, you know, look out for yourself. This is more of a discussion on the accuracy of nib sizes and why my Kaveco Lilliput seems to run off. Um, it's just not wanting to stay. Doesn't want to be here. That's fine. Speaking of fine, all of these pins right here have a fine nib. So, but they all write, fairly differently. So I want to talk about that. I have some fines here, and also have some medium nibs we're going to test out. And I'll go ahead and toss the Conklin Duraflex into kind of both to kind of show you some variants you can get just for fun. Let's go ahead and jump right into it though, and we'll go, I guess, top to bottom. So let's go ahead and start off with the Pilot Quattro. Now this is a Japanese fine nib. So if you know anything about fountain pens at all, you'll know that Japanese nibs are typically, not all the time, but typically a little finer than their Western counterparts. So there's the Pilot Quattro, and I'll just do a reverse writing line, downward line, and a line with some pressure so you can kind of see, what it's capable of. Again, this is a very fine pen. Extremely fine. Go ahead and go on to the Visconti Rembrandt. Again, fine nib. Some of these are, some of the mediums are going to be gold. All of these fine nibs are steel. You know what? That's fine. That whole thing is just destroyed. It's fine. So that was a regular line, do a reverse line right here, and then a line with some pressure. So you can see almost immediately it is a wider pen, not by a ton, but I would say maybe it's a decent bit wider. It puts down a lot more ink as well. It's a much wetter pen. Let's go ahead and bring out the Kaveco Lilliput. So you can see this is a lot more similar to the Visconti than it is to the Pilot. However, it puts down more ink than the Visconti does. So it's going to, especially on cheaper paper, appear to be a bit wider. But those two nibs are fairly close. Now, again, it's fairly common knowledge in the pen community once you get deep enough into it. The Japanese nibs are typically finer than Western nibs are. Typically by about a gauge. So, for example, the Pilot Quattro, even though it's a fine, it would be more similar to a Western extra fine. That's the conventional wisdom anyway. Let's go ahead and bring out the Duraflex, because if you don't flex it at all, I find that it writes a bit like a Western fine. We'll do a reverse line, a regular line, and I'm just going to apply a little bit of pressure here, not a lot. So you can see it's right in line with the Kaveco Lilliput, Visconti Rembrandt. Still just a tiny bit wider than the Pilot Quattro. So it's not terrible. But those are kind of what you would get from a fine nib typically. However, the main point of this video is for you to go and try out these nibs yourself if possible. If not, then I highly recommend the Goulet Nib Nook as a tool. You can kind of see, across different brands, different nib materials, what the line width is. And you're going to have some inconsistency in any pen, because a lot of nibs are hand finished. But you can kind of get a range depending on your size. Now, that's not to say that the nib gauges that the manufacturers, put on there are useless. They're not. They're a very good kind of starting point. So one thing to check for, and the biggest thing, is to see how much ink a nib puts down as well. So the Pilot Quattro is a fairly dry pen with a very fine line. It's not going to, it's going to stay about the same size. The Visconti, some of them put down a lot of ink. Some put down, a moderate amount like mine does. So it just varies. Let's go ahead and go into the medium nibs. And I'll start with a Japanese medium. This is the Platinum 3776 Century. And I'll try to go through all these inks as well for any of you curious. Now you'll notice here that even though this is a medium nib, it writes remarkably like the Western Fines. And I'll go ahead and kind of denote an F there and an M there for when the mediums start and the fines start. Excuse me. So you can see there what I was mentioning earlier, that Japanese nibs typically run about a size down from Western. So it really depends on, what pen you start with and where you go from there. It's very different if you start with a we'll use the Lamy Safari and the Pilot Metropolitan as 2 entry points. If you get a Pilot Metropolitan medium and a Lamy Safari medium, they're going to be pretty different in size. So just keep that in mind. And then again, you and your friend both might get a Metropolitan. You'll both have slightly different nib sizes. Pilot's pretty consistent, so you might not, but especially on some of the Western nibs, they're kind of iffy when it comes to size accuracy. Let's go ahead and move on to the TWSBI 580, also a medium nib. And by the way, that nib here, which I didn't cross that T, so that's going to bother me. I'm going to go back and do that. This nib here is a gold nib. So this is the first gold nib on our countdown. This is fairly stiff gold nib, though. So it feels a lot, excuse that annoying car, it feels a lot more like a steel nib because they're fairly stiff. Now, TWSBI nibs are very interesting because their line width typically matches a bit closer to the Western, but they're fairly dry pens, so you don't put down a lot of ink with them. So you can see there, it's a little bit wider than the Platinum, but not a ton. It's kind of a step up. The next pen we have here is the TWSBI VAC 700. However, I do have a different nib on this one, which is why I chose to include it. This is the Nimasign Reentry nib, so this is not a TWSBI nib. However, the feed is still somewhat dry, so let's just compare them. So you can see on the writing, it's, again, a little bit larger. This is a bit more akin to a standard Western medium. This is my preferred nib size. I still really enjoy the 580 a lot. I have 2 of them, if that's any proof to that. But TWSBI pens in general run, from my experience, kind of in between the Japanese and Western. I've got 2 more pens here. First up, the Lamy 2000. This is, again, a medium. However, it's a fairly wet medium. And this is also a gold nib. So you can see it's, again, just a tiny bit larger than the TWSBI VAC 700. Maybe it's pretty close, though. However, again, with these nibs, you're going to get some inconsistencies across the exact same pens with the exact same line width. So just keep that in mind. And very lastly, we have the Pelikan M805 Ocean Swirl. This is a medium nib as well. Okay. So this is a medium nib. I promise you. You can see the M right there. But it's fairly wide and it puts down a lot of ink. This is the pen that got me thinking about this topic. So I'm not complaining. I love the Pelican. I love it. It is super smooth. It's ridiculous. And it writes very, very well. But the line width on these Pelicans is kind of a step up. And I'd heard that before, and I'm sure if you've been in the pen community for a while, you'll have heard that too. But experiencing the difference is really astounding. It writes a lot more like the Broad that I have. So it's interesting. As a quick comparison, though, I will go ahead and do the Duraflex one more time with a little bit of force. So you can see there, if you push it, it gets to about the line width of the Pelican. I didn't push it too hard because I don't want to break anything, but it's just interesting. I thought I would talk about it a little bit because when you consider that this is a fine and that is a medium, that's confusing. So even though we went, from Japanese fine to a Western triple broad, to Western medium, if you're new in the hobby, it can be a bit polarizing to try to find what size you like to write with. My first nib was a Lamy Safari medium. Fine. I apologize. The line width was okay for me, but I wanted to be a bit smoother, so I stepped up to medium. Medium's still my preferred line width. I haven't gone up to broad yet. Just because medium's still legible as long as it isn't as Pelican. You aren't trying to write in a cramped space. But it's still smooth. Now, if you have tiny handwriting, you're not really going to have a choice. You're going to have to go with a fine, or an extra fine, or an ultra extra fine, depending on how thin you write. But if you write relatively large, you can get away with a medium, or a broad, or a double broad, triple broad, maybe even a stub if you really push it. So I would take a look at your handwriting, maybe get a standard lined notepad and just kind of compare it. Or if you want to use this video as a reference, this is just a Rhodia dot pad written on one row of the dots. So if you can get your hands on one of those and kind of compare it and see, if your handwriting is the same size as mine, which generally this isn't. I write a little bit larger than this. This is just for this example. But if your handwriting fits normally into these lines, then you can go, maybe the Visconti size will be, best for me. I'll probably try to stay away from the Pelican because it's going to be illegible. But that's completely up to you. I just thought I would talk a little bit about it and kind of show the difference between a medium and a medium. It's a very interesting thing here. But thanks for watching. If you have any experiences with nibs that were just kind of like the Pelican, just so far out of the ballpark, let me know, because I'd be interested in checking into those pens a little bit, just to see the different people's take on a nib gauge. Brian Goulet actually discussed recently that even the stub nibs, like 1.1 millimeter, they're not always 1.1 millimeter lines. It's just 1.1 millimeter at the end of the nib. So a lot of other variances play into it. Feed's a big part of it as well. But thanks for watching. Feel free to check out my other videos and subscribe if you like what you've seen. But thanks for tuning in. Bye.